The ships came without warning. One moment the sky over Earth was clear and full of stars. The next, it was full of metal. Hundreds of ships, each one bigger than any city on Earth, moved slowly into orbit. They made no sound. They fired no weapons. They simply stopped above the planet and waited, like clouds before a storm. Every government on Earth received the same message at the same time. It came in every language. It was short, polite, and completely terrifying. Greetings. You have been found and catalogued by the Galactic Dominion. Your species, designated Homo sapiens, has been assessed. You do not meet the threshold for independent civilization status. Effective immediately, humanity is classified as Tier 0 labor. Your planet remains your habitat. Your bodies belong to the Dominion. Further instructions will follow. Compliance is expected. That was it. No negotiation, no threat, no explanation of what would happen if humanity refused. They didn't even bother with a threat, because they didn't think one was needed. Sarah Voss was sitting in the United Nations building in Geneva when the message arrived. She was 34 years old, the youngest senior envoy the UN had ever appointed, and she had spent her whole career preparing for exactly this moment. First contact, the day humanity met another civilization among the stars. She had imagined it differently. The chamber around her erupted. Delegates were shouting in a dozen languages. Some were already on their phones. A few were crying. The large screens on the walls showed the same thing from every angle. The ships, dark and enormous, sitting calmly in orbit as if they owned the sky. Because apparently, they did. Sarah did not shout. She did not cry. She pulled up the message on her tablet and read it again. Then she read it a third time. Something was wrong with it. Not the content. The content was clear enough. What was wrong was the structure. The Dominion had sent a legal document, not a declaration of war. It used specific words. It referenced specific categories. It was, Sarah realized, part of a much larger system of law. And systems of law had rules. Rules meant boundaries. Boundaries meant gaps. She made a note on her tablet. Find the full legal code. Outside, the world was already falling apart. The protests started within hours. In every major city, people flooded the streets. Some held signs. Some burned things. Some just stood and stared at the sky, waiting for something to happen. Military jets flew in tight formations, but there was nothing to intercept. The Dominion ships were too high, too large, and clearly unbothered by the jets circling far below them. By the end of the first day, 3 governments had announced they would not comply. By the end of the second day, all 3 had changed their minds. Nobody said exactly what the Dominion had told them in private, but the language used in the reversals was very careful and very afraid. The Dominion did not destroy anything. They did not need to. They sent a single small craft to land outside Geneva, and from it emerged 3 beings that looked nothing like anything in any science fiction story ever written. They were tall, with gray skin and 4 arms, and eyes that moved independently of each other. They wore long gray coats that seemed to absorb light. They carried no weapons that anyone could see. They asked to speak to the representatives of humanity. Sarah was in the room. She watched the lead Dominion official, who gave a name that translated roughly as Overseer Talvin, explain the situation in perfectly fluent English. Humanity was not being conquered, Talvin said. Humanity was being organized. The Dominion managed hundreds of species across the galaxy. Most of them had initially resisted. None of them still did. Humans would work on Dominion ships, Dominion stations, and Dominion worlds. They would be fed, sheltered, and kept alive. In return, they would work wherever they were assigned. Talvin used the word servants once, then switched to the word assets. Sarah noticed that too. After the meeting, she walked back to her office alone and sat in the dark for a long time. Through her window, she could see one of the Dominion ships, a shape so large it blocked out a section of the night sky like a second horizon. It sat there, silent and patient and completely sure of itself. She opened her tablet and started writing notes. She wrote down every word Talvin had used, every legal term in the original message, every reference to Dominion law and Dominion code. Then she wrote one sentence at the top of the page. "They think this is over. It has not yet begun." She saved the file and closed her eyes. In the streets below, people were still protesting. In the sky above, the ships were still waiting. And somewhere in the vast machinery of Dominion law, there was a flaw. Sarah didn't know what it was yet, but she knew it was there. She was going to find it. For now, though, the world had knelt, and the galaxy looked down and saw exactly what it expected to see, a small, frightened species that had just learned its place. The first transports left Earth 6 weeks after the decree. They came down from orbit like dark rain, wide, flat vessels that landed in the countryside and on the outskirts of cities. Dominion officials stood at their doors with lists. Names were called. People walked forward. Families stood and watched from behind barriers that the Dominion had not bothered to put up themselves. Humans had put them up, because humans were already managing their own grief. Sarah Voss was on the third transport out of Geneva. She had not been selected randomly. The Dominion had noticed her role in the initial meetings and classified her as a Category 3 communication asset, useful for managing other humans. She would be stationed on a Dominion command ship called the Ascendant Voice, as a liaison between the human workgroups and the Dominion crew. She picked up her one allowed bag and walked up the ramp. The inside of the transport smelled like cold metal and something faintly sweet that nobody could identify. Humans sat in rows, quiet and pale. A few children clutched toys they had been allowed to bring. Old people sat very still. Young men and women stared at the floor or the walls. Nobody talked much. There was nothing useful to say. Sarah talked to everyone she could. She introduced herself. She remembered names. She asked where people were from, what they had done on Earth, what skills they had. She was calm and steady, and she made people feel slightly less afraid, which was not nothing. But she was also doing something else. She was building a list. A mechanic from Nairobi, who had spent 15 years maintaining industrial turbines. A software engineer from Seoul, who had worked on distributed communications networks. A former naval officer from Brazil, who had spent years studying enemy fleet movements. A young woman from Manchester, who had a memory so sharp she could recall entire conversations word for word. By the time the transport docked with the Ascendant Voice, Sarah had spoken to 41 people and memorized everything they had told her. Life on a Dominion ship was exactly as miserable as it sounds, and slightly more complicated than you would expect. Humans were given sleeping quarters in the lower decks, shared rooms with metal bunks and no windows. The food was nutritious and completely without joy. The work was hard and constant. They cleaned the ship. They maintained machinery. They moved cargo. They cooked food for Dominion crew members who ate in separate rooms and never thanked anyone. The Dominion crew treated them the way most people treat useful tools. Not cruelly, most of the time. Just without any particular interest. Humans were there to work. When they worked, they were ignored. When they stopped working, they were reminded to continue. The Dominion made one mistake that would cost them everything. They put humans to work everywhere. In the engine rooms, in the navigation bays, in the food preparation areas, in the communication centers, in the medical units. Humans were cheap, adaptable labor, and the Dominion used them in every corner of every ship and station. They were, the Dominion had decided, not smart enough to understand what they were seeing, and not brave enough to do anything with it, even if they were. Both of these assumptions were wrong. Within 4 months of arriving on the Ascendant Voice, Sarah had mapped the ship's power distribution system from memory. She knew which nodes controlled which functions. She knew the shift patterns of the Dominion crew. She knew which communications channels were encrypted and which ones were not. She knew this because she had simply looked and listened while she worked. And the Dominion had never once thought to watch what she was watching. She passed this information along carefully, not in writing, never in writing, in conversations, in the way a person stands next to another person while cleaning a corridor, and speaks in low tones about things that sound like complaints, but are not. In the way, a nod means one thing in one context, and something completely different in another. The network grew slowly, quietly, one person at a time. Marcus, the mechanic from Nairobi, learned the engine room of his assigned freighter better than the Dominion engineers who had designed it. He found shortcuts they didn't know existed. He also found 3 separate ways to shut the whole thing down in under 4 minutes. Ji Young, the software engineer from Seoul, was assigned to a communications relay station. She spent her first year doing exactly what she was told. She spent her second year doing slightly more than she was told, in ways that left very small traces, in places the Dominion's automated systems were not looking. The naval officer, Benedito, was assigned to a Dominion military outpost near a shipping lane. He spent his days logging cargo movements as instructed. He also spent his evenings building, in his head, a complete picture of the Dominion fleet's patrol routes, rest cycles, and resupply schedules. None of them spoke about what they were doing, not directly. The Dominion monitored communications between humans, or thought they did. What the Dominion had not accounted for was that humans had been passing information in secret for their entire history, through religion, through music, through stories, through the tiny signals in a tone of voice. The galaxy had species that communicated through chemical signals, through light patterns, through quantum entanglement. The Dominion had studied all of them and built monitoring systems for all of them. Nobody had thought to build a system to monitor the subtle look one human gave another across a crowded mess hall. 2 years passed. The network was in place across more than 200 ships and 40 stations. Information moved through it constantly, in pieces small enough to look like nothing. And at the center of it, quiet and patient and absolutely certain, was Sarah Voss. She had also found what she had been looking for since the first night. The legal flaw in the decree. It was in Article 9, subsection 4 of the Dominion Labor Code. A clause written 400 years ago for a completely different species, never updated, never removed. It stated that any species designated Tier 0 could petition for reclassification if they could demonstrate military equivalence with a Dominion fleet unit. Equivalence, not superiority, just equivalence. Sarah read it 17 times to make sure she understood it correctly. Then she filed it in the back of her mind and went back to work, because the time was not right yet. But she was smiling, just slightly, as she cleaned the corridor outside the Dominion captain's quarters. The masters never feared the servants cleaning their engines. It happened on a Tuesday. Not that the day mattered. The Dominion did not track human calendar days. But Sarah would always remember it as a Tuesday, because that is what the small clock on her bunk had shown when the alert came through the ship's communication system, and she had looked at it automatically, the way people look at clocks when something terrible is happening, as if knowing the time will somehow help. The alert was a standard Dominion broadcast. It went out to every human worker on every ship and station in the network. This was unusual. The Dominion almost never addressed humans directly. Sarah sat up on her bunk and listened. The broadcast was a recording. The voice was Overseer Talvin's. He was speaking from a planet called Verath 9, a small Dominion colony world, where a group of humans had organized what the Dominion called an unauthorized work stoppage. 43 humans had refused to enter the mining tunnels that morning. They had sat down in the open air and not moved. The recording showed what happened next. Sarah watched the screen on the wall of her quarters. She kept her face still. She had learned to keep her face still in the last 2 years, because Dominion crew members sometimes walked past, and she did not want them to see what she was thinking. What she was thinking was this. The Dominion had just made the last mistake it would ever make. The broadcast ended. Talvin's voice noted that the action had been necessary to maintain operational order. It reminded all human assets of their classification. It reminded them that compliance was not optional. For a long moment, Sarah sat completely still. Then she reached under her mattress and took out a small folded piece of paper. Actual paper, which the Dominion thought was charmingly primitive and therefore never looked for, on which was written a single word in her own handwriting. She stood up, walked to the mess hall, and sat down next to Marcus. She unfolded the paper and smoothed it flat on the table between them, then folded it again and put it in her pocket. Marcus looked at his food. He said nothing. He took a slow breath. Then he stood up, walked to the engineering bay, and 40 seconds later accidentally dropped a wrench into a conduit panel in a way that required him to call over Jisoo, who was 2 sections away. Jisoo arrived, and while they worked on the panel together, she said something quietly to the next person who passed, and that person said something to the person after that. The word moved through the Ascendant voice in 19 minutes. It moved through the network in 6 hours. Recall. That was the word on the paper, the signal they had spent 2 years waiting for. On 217 ships and 41 stations across Dominion space, humans went about their normal routines. They ate their meals. They cleaned their assigned areas. They answered when spoken to. They did not hurry. They did not draw attention. They simply kept doing exactly what they always did, because they had learned, very thoroughly, how to be invisible. And while they did all of this, they moved quietly into the positions they had already chosen. Marcus went to the engine room of the Ascendant voice with 3 other humans, and began doing what looked like routine maintenance on the tertiary power relay. This was maintenance that did not in fact need doing, but which gave them access to the main power distribution node. 2 humans assigned to the communications room started a shift change procedure that was entirely normal, except that it left both of them logged into the system at the same time, which had a specific effect on the channel switching protocols that Ji-young had spent 14 months quietly rearranging. Benedito was on a different ship entirely, a Dominion frigate called the Iron Meridian. He was mopping a corridor. He had been mopping corridors on that frigate for 17 months. He knew every door, every panel, every emergency system, every crew member's routine. At the exact moment he received the signal, he was 4 steps away from the manual override panel for the bridge lockdown system. He turned to 60. He had learned patience the hard way. Then, on every ship and station at the same time, in a moment so coordinated that the Dominion's own strategists would later call it impossible, 217 crews of human workers stopped being workers. The lights went out on the Ascendant voice. Emergency red lighting came on automatically, alarm sounds started, then were cut off mid-cycle. The Dominion crew on the bridge found that none of their navigation systems were responding, and that the 3 doors connecting the bridge to the rest of the ship had locked from the outside. Overseer Talvin, on the bridge, pressed his communicator repeatedly. Nothing. He turned to look out through the forward viewport. Beside the Ascendant voice, close enough to see clearly, was a Dominion supply vessel. Its running lights were going on and off in a pattern that made no sense as a navigation signal. It took him a moment to realize it was a pattern he recognized. It was the human distress signal, Morse code, ancient, something the Dominion had catalogued in their early surveys of Earth's communications history, and then completely forgotten about because it was so old. The message was short. "We are no longer your servants. Open a channel." Talvin sat down heavily in the captain's seat, which he had never sat in before, because it was not his seat. He looked at his 4 hands. He looked at the locked doors. He looked at the blinking lights outside. For the first time in his very long career, Overseer Talvin did not know what to do. On 217 ships and 41 stations, the galaxy's servants had just become something else entirely. Nobody had given them a name yet. The Dominion High Council received the first reports 6 hours after the ships went dark. By then, it was already too late, although they would spend several more hours not understanding that. The initial reports were confusing. Ships were not responding to communications. Stations were offline. Traffic through several key hyperlane routes had stopped. The Council assumed a technical problem. Then they assumed a localized uprising. Then, as more reports came in from more sectors, they began to understand the scale of what had happened. And the word they used among themselves, the word that had no good translation into any human language, but meant something close to impossible, started to appear in their communications with increasing frequency. 217 Dominion vessels, 41 stations, all taken at the same moment, by workers, by servants, by assets. Sarah Voss had taken control of the Ascendant Voice in the third hour. The Dominion crew, 38 of them, had been moved to the cargo hold, not harmed, given food and water, and told politely that they would be released when conditions allowed. She had taken the captain's chair and opened a channel to every human-controlled vessel in range. The faces that appeared on screen were tired and fierce and very, very awake. She looked at them for a moment before she spoke. 2 years, she said. You all waited 2 years. You all did your work. You all held on. She stopped. I know what it cost you. I know what it cost everyone. Now let's make sure it counted. There was no cheering. These were not people in the mood for cheering. They nodded, and that was enough. The plan had been built over 18 months, piece by piece, passed between people in whispered sentences and paper notes and meaningful looks. It had to work the first time, because there would not be a second chance. The Dominion had more ships than the 217 that had been taken. What they did not have was time to regroup before the second phase began. The hyperlane nodes were the key. Sarah had learned this from Benedito, who had spent months analyzing Dominion fleet movements. The Dominion's entire interstellar empire ran on a network of jump points, specific locations where ships could enter the faster-than-light lanes that connected the galaxy. Each node served dozens of routes. Destroy enough nodes, and the Empire could not move its fleets. It could not send reinforcements. It could not coordinate. You did not need to beat an empire in battle if you could cut it off from itself. The first node fell within 12 hours. It was an unmanned relay station, and the crew of a human-held freighter flew their ship directly into its power core. No weapons. They did not need weapons. The station came apart in a bright, silent bloom that was visible for millions of kilometers. The second node fell 6 hours later. The third, 4 hours after that. Each time, it was a human crew in a captured vessel doing something that the Dominion's tactical models had never accounted for. Sacrificing the ship entirely if needed, not to win, but to deny. The Dominion did not fight this way. They were used to battles where both sides wanted to survive. At Node 7, the Dominion managed to scramble a response fleet. 12 warships, the biggest in the sector, arrived to find a group of captured freighters arranged in a pattern that made no tactical sense. Until they were close enough to realize that the freighters were empty and that something was happening to the node's own automated defense systems, which had been quietly reprogrammed by Ji Young 3 months ago via a communications relay that the Dominion had never thought to check. The node defense systems opened fire on the Dominion warships. 3 of them were destroyed before the Dominion commanders understood what was happening. The remaining 9 retreated. In their reports, the Dominion commanders noted, with something that sounded like embarrassment, that they had been outmaneuvered by sanitation workers. 17 nodes fell in the first 2 weeks. Something else happened in the 3rd week. The vassal species broke. The Dominion controlled not just humans, but dozens of other civilizations across the galaxy. Most of them had been under Dominion rule for centuries. Most of them had long since stopped thinking about resistance. But when the news spread, and it spread fast, because humans had made sure the communications network they had quietly modified would carry it far, something changed. A species called the Vreth, small and pale, and long accustomed to working Dominion mines, stopped working on the same day across 11 different worlds. They did not do it in coordination with humanity. They simply watched what the humans had done and decided that if the newest, weakest species in the Dominion could do it, they could too. Others followed. Not all at once, not all together. But one by one, the Dominion's empire began to crack at its edges. The High Council sent an emergency transmission to the Ascendant Voice. They wanted to negotiate. Sierra read the message carefully. Then she wrote her reply and transmitted it on every frequency the modified communications network could reach, which was most of them. The message was not long. You found us, and you measured us. You decided what we were. You put us to work in your ships and your mines, and your stations. You fed us enough to keep us useful, and ignored us enough to feel comfortable. You watched us clean your floors, and assumed that was all we were capable of. You declared us servants. We accepted, we learned, we remembered. Now, we collect what is owed. She paused before adding the final line. We will speak when we are ready, not before. The council did not respond. There was not much they could say. 42 nodes had fallen. The Dominion's ability to move its fleets across the galaxy had been cut by more than half. Its vassal species were in open revolt on 19 worlds. Its military was spread thin, chasing fires in every direction, and the people they were chasing had spent 2 years learning exactly how Dominion military tactics worked. The galaxy, which had looked at humanity and seemed servants, was now looking at something it did not have a name for. Sarah stood at the viewport of the Ascendant Voice and watched the stars. She was tired. She had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. She had made decisions that she knew people had died for, and she would carry those decisions forever. This was not glory. It was not triumph. It was something much harder and much more necessary. But it was not over. Not yet. The Dominion's capital world still stood. The High Council was still in place. And there was still a law that needed to be rewritten. She turned away from the stars and went back to work. The fleet that arrived at the Dominion capital world was not what anyone expected. The Dominion High Council had prepared for warships. They had prepared for bombardment, for the kind of overwhelming force that empires use against other empires. They had moved their own remaining ships into defensive formation around the planet. They had prepared speeches about negotiated surrenders and the long history of Dominion law and the importance of civilized resolution. What arrived was 61 ships, mostly freighters, a few captured Dominion vessels, nothing that looked like a fleet of conquest, and one message. We are not here to destroy you. We are here to speak. Open the channel. The council opened the channel. Sarah Voss appeared on their screens. She was wearing the same gray work clothes she had worn for 3 years. She had not changed into anything formal, and this was not an accident. She wanted them to see what she was. You know who I am, she said. You know what has happened. I don't want to explain it to you. I want to read you something. She held up a tablet and read the Article 9, Subsection 4 of the Dominion Labor Code, the clause about reclassification. The clause she had found on the first night, in her dark office, while the protests burned in the streets below. She closed the tablet. We are petitioning for reclassification under your own law. You will notice that we have demonstrated military equivalence with more than one Dominion fleet unit. You will also notice that we have done this while following every other provision of Dominion law that applied to us. We did not start this conflict. We did not fire first. We did not execute anyone's children. The silence on the Dominion end was very long. The lead council member, an ancient and gray-skinned being called Eldest Rova, spoke slowly. What you have done is without precedent in 400 years of Dominion history. I know. You are aware that even if we accept the reclassification petition, it does not address the vassal species currently in revolt on 19 worlds. I am aware of that, Sarah said. That is why we are not only filing a reclassification petition, we are also proposing a replacement for the current Dominion legal structure. A new framework. We have drafted it. I will transmit it to you now. She sent the document. It was long. It had taken Sarah and 12 other humans 8 months to write it, working from legal codes they had copied, memorized, and studied in stolen moments on the lower decks of Dominion ships. It drew on human legal history, on frameworks they had built and broken and rebuilt over centuries. It was not perfect, but it was built on one principle that the Dominion had never had the occasion to consider. No permanent masters. No permanent servants. Every species in the Dominion's territory would have standing under the new framework. Every species would have the right to petition for change. Every grievance would have a legal path. The Dominion itself would not be dissolved. Its administrative infrastructure was too useful and too large to simply abandon, but it would become a council of equals rather than a hierarchy of owners. Earth would not take a throne. That had never been the plan. Eldest Rova read the document. The other council members read it. They conferred among themselves for 3 hours, during which Sarah sat in the captain's chair of the Ascendant Voice, and drank terrible reconstituted coffee, and waited. Her communicator chimed twice. Messages from Marcus, from Benedito, from Jiyoung. Checking in, waiting with her. She sent the same reply to all three. Not yet. When Rova came back on screen, she looked older than she had 3 hours ago. Or perhaps she had always looked this way, and Sarah had only now noticed. The Council has reviewed the proposed framework, Rova said. We have significant objections to several provisions. We will need to negotiate. Of course, Cyrus said. We also... Rova stopped. She seemed to be choosing her words with unusual care. We also wish to understand how this happened. How you organized across 200 ships without our knowledge. How you achieved this level of coordination. Syra thought about it for a moment. You watched us clean your floors, she said. You watched us fix your engines. You watched us serve your food. And you assumed that because we were doing simple things, we were simple people. She paused. We were not cleaning your floors. We were learning your ships. Rova was quiet for a moment. We made an error in our assessment of your species. Yes, Syra said simply, you did. The negotiations took 4 months. They were hard. The Council pushed back on nearly every provision. There were times when the talks nearly collapsed, when Syra sat alone in her quarters on the Ascendant Voice and thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. But she had spent 3 years learning patience, and she used it now the same way she had used it on the lower decks. As a tool. The Galactic Charter was signed at a station in neutral space, attended by representatives of 47 species. Humans sat at the same long table as the Dominion Council and the ambassadors of the vassal worlds. The signing was not dramatic. There was no ceremony that anyone would remember. People sat and signed documents and shook hands or equivalent gestures, and then it was done. Earth received nothing from the new order except what it had asked for. Recognition as a full-standing civilization, the same legal rights as every other species, and a seat on the new Galactic Council. It also received, quietly and without fanfare, a different kind of status. Not written into the Charter, not official, but understood by every species that had watched the last 3 years unfold. Earth was the guarantor. The quiet, patient power that everyone knew was there and that nobody wanted to see move again. Not because Earth was cruel, not because humanity had won through brutality, but because humanity had been the lowest thing in the galaxy and had still managed to be the most dangerous, and it had chosen, after all of that, to build something instead of burning everything. Sarah stood outside the signing station in a corridor that had a long window looking out into space. The stars were very clear and very cold and very far away. Marcus came and stood next to her. Neither of them said anything for a while. What do we do now? He asked eventually. Sarah thought about it. 3 years ago she had been sitting in a dark office, watching ships fill the sky, reading a legal document with a flaw in it. 3 years of sleeping in metal bunks, and eating terrible food, and whispering in corridors, and carrying the weight of 200 ships in her head. Now we go home, she said. Marcus nodded. He looked out at the stars. Do you think they'll try something again? Some other empire? Some other species? Sarah considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. Maybe, she said. But they'll know the story. All of them will know the story. She turned away from the window. Other species had warships. We had something more dangerous. We had the memory of being nothing, and they made us use it. She walked back down the corridor. Behind her, the stars burned on, cold and ancient and completely indifferent. The galaxy had learned one lesson in the last 3 years. It had cost it an empire and 4 months of negotiations, and the complete rewriting of laws that had stood for 4 centuries. It did not need to learn it again.